She was standing at the top of the stairs when they told me to leave. My stepmother, arms crossed, watching me drag a garbage bag across the hardwood floor my father had refinished with his own hands the summer before he died. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Her lawyer had already said everything that needed to be said, right there in the boardroom of a downtown Toronto law office with the kind of fluorescent lighting that makes everyone look like they're already dead. I was 23 years old. My name is not on that will, the lawyer had told me. Not in any capacity. The estate, the house in Forest Hill, the cottage on Georgian Bay, the shares in my father's logistics company, everything passed to my stepmother, entirely, immediately. There was a provision, he'd said, flipping through papers without looking up, for a one-time payment of $10,000, a number my father had probably spent on a single weekend entertaining clients. I remember thinking, he used to call me his compass. Every road trip we ever took, just the two of us, he'd put me in charge of the map. Even after GPS existed, he said it mattered that I knew how to read where I was going. Standing in that hallway, I couldn't find north at all. My father's name was Richard Calloway. He built his freight brokerage from a spare bedroom in a rented apartment in Brampton, worked 18-hour days for a decade, and by the time I was born had turned it into a company with contracts across 4 provinces. He was not a warm man, not in the way people mean when they say that. He didn't do birthday parties or school concerts. But he showed up. That was his thing. He showed up, and he paid attention, and when he talked to you, you were the only person in the room. He married my stepmother, Gwendolyn, 4 years before he died. She was a corporate events planner with a talent for making rooms feel expensive. She had a son from her first marriage, her son Tate, who was 26 and had the kind of easy confidence that comes from never having been told no. I tried in the beginning. I genuinely tried. But Tate and I moved through the world like 2 weather systems that shouldn't be in the same airspace. My father died of a cardiac event on a Thursday morning in February. He was 57. He was on a treadmill in the gym of the Marriott in Calgary, where he was meeting with a new client. The hotel staff found him. I found out from a phone call, not from Gwendolyn, but from his assistant, a woman named, well, it doesn't matter, she cried on the phone. That's what I remember. The funeral was a Gwendolyn production. Tasteful flowers. Catered reception. A slideshow that managed to include exactly 0 photos of me. I should have known then. I should have known when I looked at that slideshow and felt like a stranger at my own father's funeral. But grief makes you slow. It makes you charitable in ways you can't afford. The will reading was 3 weeks later. $10,000. The lawyer, a man named Aldous Parrish, silver hair, soft voice, a way of delivering bad news like he was reading a weather report, explained that the will had been updated 8 months prior. 8 months. My father had been alive 8 months ago. He had called me on my birthday 7 months ago. We had talked for 40 minutes about whether I should go back to school, about the job I had in Hamilton doing logistics coordination for a mid-sized manufacturer, about a hockey game neither of us had actually watched, but both pretended to follow. He never mentioned a will. He never mentioned any of it. I drove back to Hamilton in a February snowstorm, the kind that makes the highway feel like the inside of a snow globe, and I sat in my apartment for 4 days eating crackers and not answering my phone. On the 5th day, I got a letter, hand-delivered to my building, no return address. Inside was a key, not a house key, smaller, old-fashioned, the kind with a hollow barrel and a simple bit at the end. Like something from a lockbox. There was a single index card folded around it, and on it, in my father's handwriting, I would have known it anywhere, that cramped, left-leaning print, 3 words. Don't sell it. That was all. I turned the card over. Nothing. I turned the key over in my hand for a long time. It was brass, slightly tarnished, with a number stamped into the shank. Not a lockbox. A property key, the kind you'd get from a management office or a real estate agent in a small town. I didn't sleep that night. My father had been meticulous about his finances. I knew this because he had taught me to be meticulous about mine. He believed in paper trails, in documentation, in keeping records of everything. He also believed I was learning in secrets. I started with what I knew. His company's records were inaccessible to me now. Gwendolyn had made sure of that within a week of his death, changing passwords and locking me out of anything that bore his name. But I still had his old email address saved in my phone from years ago, when we'd used a shared account to coordinate a hunting trip up north that we kept meaning to take and never did. On a long shot, I tried it. The password he'd always used, the year of his first big contract, followed by his mother's name, didn't work. But the secondary email did. A Gmail account I hadn't known about, created under a slight variation of his name. His contact linked to it in an old text thread about, of all things, a plumbing repair at a rental property. A rental property. I had never heard my father mention a rental property. I spent 2 days going through that email account, feeling like a trespasser in someone else's life. There were messages to a property management company, a small outfit based in a town called Vermilion Bay, in Northwestern Ontario, about 7 hours northwest of Toronto. Correspondence about a roof repair in 2019, a water heater replacement in 2021, property tax receipts stretching back 12 years. 12 years. He'd owned this property for 12 years and never told me. Why would a man who built his company on transparency own a cabin in the Ontario boreal forest and say nothing? I found the address in the tax receipts. A property on the eastern shore of Eagle Lake, outside Vermilion Bay. No photos in the emails, no description beyond the municipal address. Just the ongoing quiet evidence of a man paying to maintain something he apparently needed no one to know about. The key in my hand suddenly felt heavier. I told my manager I needed a week. Personal emergency. She was understanding. I packed a bag, filled the tank on my truck, and drove northwest out of Hamilton on the 401, then up through Barrie, through Sudbury, through the long northern stretch, where the Canadian Shield takes over and the land becomes something older and less patient. Pine and granite and lakes that go on longer than any map seems to suggest. Radio stations fade. The sky gets bigger. I've always loved that drive, actually. It's one of the things my father gave me, a tolerance for long roads, for the particular silence of being between places. It took me nearly 8 hours, with stops. I pulled onto the logging road that the property address indicated around 4 in the afternoon, in late March, when the snow is still deep in northwestern Ontario, but the light has started to come back. The access road hadn't been plowed recently. I had to park a quarter-kilometer in and walk. The cabin appeared through the trees the way things appear in dreams, suddenly, without warning, all at once. It was bigger than I'd expected. A 2-story A-frame with a wraparound porch, cedar shingles gone silver with age, a fieldstone chimney running up one side. The windows were boarded. The front steps had lost 2 boards to rot. But the structure itself was solid, the way things built by people who expected them to last are solid. I stood there for a moment and just looked at it. "Dad, what is this?" The key worked in the front door. Inside, it smelled like cold and cedar and something underneath both of those. A faint trace of pipe smoke, though my father hadn't smoked in 20 years, or so I'd believed. There was a wood stove in the main room, a kitchen with a hand pump at the sink, a set of bunk beds in a small room off the back. Simple furniture, all of it built rather than bought. A shelf of paperbacks, a shelf of fishing gear, and a workbench in the corner of the main room beneath one of the boarded windows, with a small metal lockbox bolted to the wall above it. My key fit that lock too. Inside the box was not money, not gold, not anything cinematic. There was a USB drive, a folded letter, and beneath both of those a photograph I had never seen. My father, maybe 35, standing in front of this cabin in summer, arm around a woman I didn't recognize. They were both laughing. He looked light in a way I don't have many memories of. I took everything to the table. I read the letter first. My father's handwriting, 5 pages, dated 14 months before his death. He wrote that he had not been well, not physically. His heart had been giving him warnings for 2 years that he'd chosen to interpret as stress rather than disease. He wrote that he had started to think about what he would leave behind, and had realized, with some shame, that what he'd built professionally was not the same as what he'd built personally. The company was real. The money was real. But somewhere in the building of those things, he had made choices that cost him other things, and he was trying, at the end, to make an accounting. The cabin had belonged to his older brother, my uncle, whom I had never met, whom I hadn't known existed. His name was Patrick. He and my father had been estranged for nearly 30 years over something my father called, in the letter, the matter of the Callaway land, a parcel of farmland in Prince Edward County that their parents had left behind, and which my father, in his 20s, had sold without Patrick's knowledge or consent. They had never spoken again. Patrick had died of cancer 9 years ago, without children, without a will, and the property on Eagle Lake had come to my father by default, through an estate lawyer who had tracked him down. He had kept it, he had maintained it, he had never set foot in it again, until, the letter told me, the year before he died. I came up here in September, he wrote, and I stayed for 4 days. I didn't fish, I didn't fix anything. I just sat in your uncle's chair and tried to understand what I had done. I don't think I got all the way there. But I think I got closer than I had before. He wrote that he had discovered, in the cabin, evidence that Patrick had known about the sale, that Patrick had not simply been victimized. He had, in his own quiet way, documented everything. There was a file, my father wrote, kept in a second lockbox under the floorboards near the wood stove. In that file was a copy of a transaction that my father's own business partner at the time, a man named Desmond Holt, who had since become a senior partner at one of Toronto's largest real estate law firms, had facilitated under false pretenses. Desmond had told my father that Patrick had been consulted and had agreed. He had forged Patrick's signature. My father had not known, or had not asked enough questions to know, which, he wrote, might be the same thing. When I found that file, I understood why Patrick never spoke to me again. He wasn't protecting himself from me. He was protecting himself from the knowledge that the person who had betrayed him most completely was someone I trusted. And then he wrote about Gwendolyn. He wrote it quietly, without melodrama, the way he did everything. He had begun to suspect, in the last year of his life, that Gwendolyn and Desmond Holt had been in contact in ways that had nothing to do with their professional acquaintance. He had found things, messages, a transfer of funds he couldn't account for, a conversation that stopped when he walked into the room. He didn't know what they were planning. But he knew enough to know that his updated will, which Desmond had recommended, and which he had signed during a period of particular exhaustion and medicated fogginess following a minor cardiac procedure, might not have reflected what he had actually intended. He had not been well enough to fight it then. He was writing this letter, he said, so that someone could fight it after. You were always my compass, Callum. I'm sorry I didn't say it more plainly while I still could. I sat at that table for a long time after I finished reading. Outside, the late March light was going. The pines were turning black against the sky. Somewhere on the lake, something, a bird, the ice settling, I couldn't tell, made a sound like a creak under weight. I opened the laptop I'd brought, charged my truck's battery, and plugged in the USB drive. It held scanned documents, the same file my father had described, digitized, a copy of the original land transaction from 30 years ago, with Patrick's forged signature, and a scanned memo on Desmond Holt's law firm letterhead, dated 18 months ago, discussing, in language careful enough to be deniable but specific enough to be damning, the management of my father's estate in a way that would ensure the primary beneficiary remained Gwendolyn Callaway, née Marsh, Gwendolyn Marsh, Tate's mother, Desmond Holt's first cousin. I had to read that last part 3 times. First cousins. Desmond and Gwendolyn. They had not met at a charity gala, as she had always claimed. They had grown up together. I did not sleep that night either. I lay in my father's brother's bunk bed, in the dark, in the cold, and I tried to think clearly. By morning, I had a plan. But the plan required something I didn't have, a lawyer I could trust, which meant a lawyer with no connection to Desmond Holt's world, which is a more specific constraint than it sounds when you're talking about Toronto estate law. I called 3 people the next day, standing outside the cabin with my phone held up to catch signal. The third one was a woman named, I'll just call her my lawyer, because she asked me to be careful about what I put in writing anywhere, even now. She practiced in Thunder Bay. She had no professional history with Desmond Holt. She listened to me for 40 minutes without interrupting, and at the end she said, "Bring me everything. Don't email it. Drive it." I drove it. The next 6 weeks were the worst of my life and the most purposeful. My lawyer filed a formal challenge to the probate of my father's will, citing undue influence and potential fraud in its execution. She brought in a forensic document examiner who found irregularities in the witness attestations. She contacted the Law Society of Ontario's Complaints Division regarding Desmond Holt, and she located, through the estate records, a notarized letter my father had apparently lodged with a separate solicitor in Oakville, a letter naming me as his intended primary heir, predating the updated will by 6 months, which he had apparently created as a safeguard when he first started to suspect something was wrong. He had been 2 moves ahead. Even sick, even tired, even in the fog of medication and grief and guilt about his brother, he had been 2 moves ahead. That was my father. Gwendolyn's lawyers were quick and expensive. They filed objections, counterfilings, requests for delays. Tate called me once, during this period, from a number I didn't recognize. He said, "You're making a mistake." I said, "I know what Desmond is to your mother." There was a pause, and then he hung up. I took that as confirmation. The hardest moment came on a Tuesday afternoon in May, in a meeting room in my lawyer's Thunder Bay office. Her investigator had turned up something we hadn't anticipated. Gwendolyn had already begun the process of selling the Eagle Lake property. She had apparently known about it. Had known about it before my father died, which meant she had known he was going up there, had known what he might find, and had moved to liquidate it as quickly and quietly as possible once the estate was hers. The buyer was a numbered company. The numbered company led, through 2 shells, to a real estate development group in which Tate Marsh held a minority stake. I sat in that chair and thought about Patrick, my uncle, who I would never meet, who had kept a file for 30 years, who had died without knowing that the file would matter. "Tell me this is enough," I said to my lawyer. "It's more than enough," she said. "The Ontario Superior Court of Justice ruled in my favor 11 months after my father's death. The will was set aside. The fraudulent transaction, the original land deal, the one that had cost my uncle everything, was referred to the Law Society and eventually to the RCMP. Desmond Holt surrendered his license to practice law. He did not avoid criminal charges. Gwendolyn's assets were frozen pending investigation of estate fraud. Tate's development company lost its financing when the numbered company structure became public record and 2 of its other investors walked away. I was named administrator of my father's estate. The company, the cottage on Georgian Bay, the house in Forest Hill, which I sold, because it held nothing I wanted to keep. All of it came through the process battered but intact. I paid my lawyer. I paid the forensic examiner. I paid the estate taxes. What remained was still more than I had imagined having at 23. But what I kept thinking about, through all of it, was the cabin. I went back that September. Took 2 weeks off. I repaired the porch steps and replaced the boarding on the windows with new glass. I pulled out the old hand pump and replaced it with something that actually worked. I found the lockbox under the floorboards, the one my father had written about, already empty, already opened, by him or by someone before him, and I left it open. Something about that felt right. I put the photograph of my father and Patrick on the shelf above the wood stove. The one where they were both laughing. I didn't know what they were laughing at. It doesn't matter. What matters is that it existed, that there was a moment, before everything else, when my father was light. On my last evening there, I took a canoe out on Eagle Lake at dusk. The Boreal is a particular kind of quiet at that hour. The loons were out. There was still enough light to see the far shore, black spruce coming right down to the water, and above them a sky going from gold to green to the deep particular blue that means the stars are about to start. I thought about what my father had written. I came up here and tried to understand what I had done. I thought about Patrick, who had kept a file instead of making a call, who had let silence do what confrontation wouldn't. I thought about how much damage had been done in my family by people deciding that the hard conversations could wait. I am not going to make that mistake. The cabin is mine now. I've started driving up once a month. There's a family 3 properties down the lake, been there 4 generations. They told me when they came over in October with a bottle of rye and a peach pie to introduce themselves, and they knew Patrick. They said he was quiet. They said he was kind. They said he kept a beautiful garden on the south side of the property, though it's all grown over now. I'm going to clear it in the spring. I don't know yet exactly what I'll plant. But I know the soil is good. I know the light is right. And I know that some things, given enough time and enough attention, have a way of coming back.